her to come and talk about. So over to you, Antonia.
Thank you. And thank you. I'm very happy to be here. Also, just from the conversation we were having in the breakout room, actually, I realized that this will be a very interesting discussion for us. So, as I was saying, I'm not presenting something that is ending, but actually I'm presenting something that is just starting. And therefore, I think this group would be our, let's say, test to see how those ideas could actually be useful and helpful to other colleagues. And it's a little bit the story of a pilot project, but also the story of an ambition that I've been trying to nourish with a group of colleagues, not just in academia, but beyond academia, in the museum sector, in school education, and of course, an expert in artificial intelligence, who is a former colleague at Loughborough University. But I'll try to keep it short so that we have more time for conversations afterwards. But I'll give you just a bit of background for the ones who don't know me. My background is in history and computer science, and I spent the first 12, 15 years of my professional life in Italy, working in the cultural heritage sector, supporting museum archives and private foundations to explore new ways of using digital technologies to make learning, and in particular history learning, more exciting and engaging and accessible. And then I had the joy to meet Joe Lambert and his group some time ago. I was invited to a training in Malta, an island, a country in the Mediterranean, southern Mediterranean area, while I was still working in Italy, and I discovered digital storytelling. So everything, when I mention digital storytelling, I refer to Joe Lambert's model and story center model. But then I had the opportunity to move to the UK 12 years ago to Loughborough University, where I spent 10 years. And there, working with colleagues, starting from Professor Michael Wilson, we set up a storytelling academy where we developed new ways of thinking about digital storytelling as a method, applying it in different contexts with a focus mainly on social justice, but also keeping in mind my roots in the cultural heritage sector, bringing it back to the fore where possible. And then I moved in February 2024 to Teesside University in the northeast of England, not far from Newcastle, where we are setting up a new institute for collective place leadership. And we thought that storytelling, applied storytelling, participatory storytelling could play a big part in this space where we are trying to explore new ways of working with communities for communities. And this particular project I'm introducing today is a project that, as I said, starting from a conversation with colleagues and challenges that colleagues were facing, not just in higher education, but also in school education. And also to respond to some of the questions that myself and the group of researchers who've been working with me, and when I say researchers, I mean colleagues from a number of disciplines. And I'm very pleased that this group is formed by people coming not just from the arts and humanities, but beyond the scope of our traditional way of thinking about application of storytelling, or what storytelling is. And one of the key questions I've been always exploring when working on a variety of projects, and just to mention projects I've been involved in, I've been working on large international initiatives on climate change in Colombia, on the Paramo region, gender-based violence in Southeast Asia, India in particular. I did some work, waste management in Kenya, and then more with a focus on formal and informal education in Europe. And then I had the joy to work with the Smithsonian as a fellow, and since then keep exploring with them the use of museum resources within the storytelling practice. That's the context of me and my research. But I always try to respond in my mind to a couple of questions that I'm trying to address today with you as well. One is the role of co-creation within digital storytelling, and thinking about education, the implications of co-creation in an assessment process are challenging, and we can talk more about that. So co-creation is the ideal way of developing a narrative and facilitating mutual learning in a participatory approach within the storytelling conventional 5-step or 7-step process. But what are the implications in when we are applying digital storytelling for other reasons? And then there is this, of course, this very timely conversation about truth and authenticity, and the implications of the use of these words in different, again, in the different ways we apply storytelling. But I thought if Zoom is not abandoning me, I thought that would be a good start to share with you a digital story that was made by a student. And this was a data science student. And I was teaching digital storytelling at master's level in Loughborough for data science students to make them reflect on the power of, and we've got Michael, you have an interest in statistics, right, in numbers. We were working with them on this idea of building a story around statistics, but a story that was personal or with strong personal relevance. And this is the story that this student developed. And then after that, she developed her own dissertation master thesis on the use of digital storytelling in her own field. And you will see, but this story inspired my thinking about then the use of digital storytelling to co-design and co-develop an anti-racist teaching practice. Let's try to see if it works.
I think the volume is not very clear, Antonia. Is there some way you could amp up the volume, or it's probably just the platform that we're using?
Is it better now?
Maybe you can check the share function to see if you share the
Yeah, I did it. Yeah, I did it. We had some technical issues earlier. So I'll tell you what is it about, and then I'll share the slides maybe so you can watch it back, because it's a beautiful story.
Thank you.
But just to say, so this was a story that was her memory about you may have heard about George Floyd and what happened, I mean, the key message is that hope is a weapon. But anyway, so the number, the statistic she was using was that 8:46. That was the time since George Floyd was somehow attacked by the police, and then he died after this 8 minutes 46 seconds. And what she did, she reflected on the spiritual value of the numbers. And trying to extract meaning from the numbers. So to make the numbers memorable, attached to a narrative that is hard to retell, but reflecting also on the impact of that narrative on an individual that is not really part of that particular event, but still impacted through social media. Anyway, just to say, that was the assessment of this data science module, in addition with a short essay and the storyboard in which the student would explain the dynamics, the thinking behind the choices in the making of the story. That was just to provide a bit of context of the need, I realized from the student's perspective, of different ways of using types of assessment and the kind of care they put in crafting those narratives, those videos. You could, at that time, I was expecting that they would just create short, quickly made videos, whereas I realized since that they were attaching the reflective report on how they made them and the meaning-making process that digital storytelling allowed to them as individuals, but also as a collective, because they were working through, as you know, the 5-step process. So implies a story circle with mutual exchange at different phases for them to feedback each other. So that was the trigger for myself in exploring even more the use of digital storytelling within formal education. And then I had the opportunity to meet Diane Louise Jordan. So she is the first Black British presenter on the BBC on a very iconic program for kids in the 80s and 90s. Now she is in her 60s. I'm not going to play the clip because the audio won't be good, but here is a snippet of a short interview we did together where she explains why now that she completed her career as a broadcaster is starting a fantastic project called The Making of Black Britain. That is an oral history project in which she is in collaboration with Google Arts and Culture, and I can share the link with you so you can see what she's developing with them, and the British Library and other organizations, prestigious organizations in the UK. She's trying to collect oral histories to interrogate, investigate what being British means. And the anecdote she tells in these short snippets I cut for you today is when she was invited, as a very popular broadcaster, she was invited to a conference for a keynote. And then at the end of this keynote, there was a person in the room who said, "Oh, actually, I'm very surprised. No, I'm very touched by the way in which you speak English. You are so eloquent. You speak English so well." And then she said, "Yes, but I am English." And so that assumption that because of the color of her skin, the person in the room was thinking that she was not British. And then this person said, yeah, I understand you are English. I mean, truly English. And then since then, she started thinking, yeah, but what does it mean? What does it mean to be British as a first generation person? Her parents were from the Windrush generation. I don't know if you heard about the scandal of the Windrush generation, but anyway, I can send you sources about that. But so then that was her motivation behind starting and setting up a huge archive to investigate what being British means, not just to Black people, but to everyone, and how being Black or Black Britain developed over time and shifted even in the use of language, not just verbal language, but visual language. So we met, and I tried to convince Diane that in addition to oral histories, which are not very accessible to everyone because they will be kept in the British Library, to add digital storytelling. And so we started to add some digital stories made, some of my students, or workshops we ran together, and pilot this idea of using digital storytelling as a more versatile tool to make those narratives more accessible. And then we were both invited by London Transport Museum to run what we call a CPD, so a professional development opportunity for school teachers. We invited them. There was an occasion we wanted to mark. There was the 75th anniversary of the British Nationality Act. And we spent 2 days with those teachers, in addition to some online sessions we did before with them, in advance with them, to try and think about how digital storytelling could help them decolonize the curriculum. And therefore, when we met, instead of telling them what digital storytelling is, we did some activities, creative activities, to co-develop a draft toolkit that would enable them to then implement some digital storytelling activity into the school environment, with a particular focus on anti-racist teaching. So, and using objects from an exhibition in London Transport Museum that was called Legacies Exhibition, and was an exhibition of Caribbean workforce in the London transports, on the tube and buses. and using the objects from the museum exhibitions as prompts for the digital storytelling process. So supporting teachers, students, families, the museum to reconnect, come together, share their knowledge in an equal way, and use digital storytelling as the process and platform for them to really have conversations in a more equal way. And then we thought about how to include those activities within the curriculum. And the easiest way for those schools, we started in 23-24, the easiest way for them was to develop a new computing module. So instead of adding this activity within a history or English curriculum, was easier to introduce a computing module where let's say the entry point was the making of a video, but actually they were learning about British history by making the video and co-creating stories with, in particular, families of students, was cultural background was very rich, and therefore gave them the opportunity to share their experiences, memories, and stories, and inform this collective learning on Black Britain. This is just some feedback we got from the initial activity we ran with them. Of course, positive outcomes in terms of enjoyment, engagement of the students in the digital storytelling process. We also had heard from some teachers who felt that less pressure, in particular white teachers who felt less intimidated by this notion of decolonizing the curriculum, which is another challenge. And learning about Black British histories in ways which are not conventional, top-down ways of sharing knowledge. But of course, there were challenges. This is another story you may, when I'm going to share with you the slides, you can watch. So on the left, there is a beautiful story made by another student of mine, and she's a creative practitioner, and in this particular story is reflecting on being a mixed race young person in Britain, and how to explain her how hard it is to explain to peers the depth and the background, the richness, the depth, but also the challenges that the family went through over the recent generations. But there is the story, and there is also a reflection on the process of digital storytelling. So very often as facilitators, as educators, we just look at the output. And again, in assessment, it's very important and critical to think about, what are we assessing? Are we assessing just the story as an object? Or are we monitoring and assessing somehow the process of being involved in digital storytelling? And the reason why I included Erin in this particular slide is because she was one person who actually didn't engage in one of the steps of the process. So when we ran the activity in the classroom with other students, she didn't join the story circle, right? So she didn't feel ready to share her story at that stage, but then she made a fantastic story. And then it was up to me to make that process more inclusive, to allow her to share a difficult story with friends who were not aware about the complexity of the narrative per se. And therefore, back to the question I was asking in the beginning, the role of co-design, the role of co-creation. For example, between the story circle and the script writing phase, because I noticed there's difficulty, not just of this particular individual, but some other individuals, I introduced a new step that is a collaborative storyboarding exercise in pairs. So where instead of sharing, or in addition, or as an intermediate level, instead of sharing the story to a larger group of 10, 15 people, they were working in pairs, using a storyboard, but acting one as the listener and one as the teller. So where they were working in meaning-making, interpretation, and representation in pairs, where one person would tell the story and the other one would capture the story on the storyboard and would ask questions to unpack the complexity of the story in a much more intimate space. So what I'm saying is that the lack of engagement was not a lack of interest of that particular student, but was a lack of inclusivity in a process that we presume is inclusive by its own nature, but actually sometimes it requires an additional effort from our side to make it really deeply inclusive. Back to the project with Diane, London Transport Museum and the schools, positive feedback, but as you know, schools, but university as well, very often they have to deal with limited resources, not just in terms of technology, but in particular in terms of time, and also support for students in developing new content. And then there is this other challenge that I'm sure you are all facing with your students as well, that is the use of generative AI tools, especially when students are writing essays, and the lack of authenticity of whatever they are producing. So in a way, digital storytelling could be a response to this second challenge, but the first challenge is something that I thought we needed to reflect even more. And then I've been having this conversation with a colleague who is an expert in AI. She's a professor of AI and data science. And we've been developing this idea of AI-powered storytelling as a way of actually not asking questions, asking AI to respond, but actually training AI through this digital storytelling co-creative approach. And therefore, we thought of this AI-powered storytelling as a two-way learning process in which the co-creation, and I'll share with you the key aims of this project idea we are developing at the moment, but the idea is to co-curate a data set so that we would use the metadata of the collections of the museum, the collection of the Making of Black Britain oral history archives, and the digital stories created to really train AI on the evolving language, especially when telling story about complex histories, let's say. So if you think about the metadata that sometimes we find in museum collections, they may be a bit outdated in terms of language, even the way in which certain things are named or representation sometimes is inappropriate. And so we thought that by running digital storytelling workshops with young people and families whose cultural background comes from, for example, like Diane, the Windrush generation, Caribbean origin, or African origin, how they can enrich and inform and reshape the language in a more appropriate way. And the idea is also that then this system, I'm going to show you a model of the system we are thinking. The system would also help the teachers create short video summaries so that the digital stories are actually to inform the data set, but then the system would respond to the queries from the students with something very similar to digital stories as well, with an idea of creating lesson plans to support students to use AI in a more responsible way, where they realize that they're not just digesting whatever they get and assuming that whatever they get from AI is correct and truthful, but actually would allow them to rethink critically about how important it is to inform the shaping of this language models, large language models. And the idea would be then to support, as I was saying, teachers in co-creating lesson plans using this system in a way that would also inform, as I said, the large language models to reduce the racist attitude of AI models that, of course, they are quite obvious, but obvious to the ones who go with a critical eye, but dangerous for the ones who just reuse whatever they get. And this is the model we've been developing so far. Of course, we are still trying to understand different challenges and how the flow could work, but very basically, in a very simple way. And this was created by my colleague Georgina Cosma. The idea is to just start from the metadata, run the digital storytelling workshops asking students and teachers to interrogate the database of resources, use the objects from the database to prompt conversations, but then create the stories with objects and stories from families and family archives to then include those digital stories into the database in a way that the system is trained and the language evolves, and then to co-create lesson plans for teachers on Black British history. So that's the ambition. This was another story I wanted to share with you, which is actually on the Making of Black Britain archive on Google Arts and Culture. And it's a very interesting way. And there's another student who is British Caribbean. That means she was born in England, but with a Caribbean heritage. And she realized by retelling this story of the experience she has every time she goes back to the Caribbean, despite not being from the Caribbean herself, but just her parents, this idea, why do we need to call ourselves British Caribbean, not Caribbean British? You know, what even the order of words, who decided why British first and Caribbean second? So is there a different importance if we just swap the order of those words when we define ourselves and our own identity? And just questioning the language. And this is a good example of how a story like this could actually reintroduce and question and challenge an existing way of using the language and how language could evolve over time. So that was just hopefully a brief introduction on our thinking around this complementary use of digital storytelling in a formal education setting as a way of bridging the knowledge, existing knowledge from museum collections and other existing collections with ever-evolving family archives and experiential knowledge and memories from everyday life to improve the ways in which we approach, we represent, and we interpret certain narratives supported by AI, but not digesting whatever AI suggests. So that's everything for me. But I'm very happy to share these slides because the multimedia part is the most exciting bit, because you would hear from the protagonist of this evolving project. And then I just put a couple of links with material on other projects we are developing. And yeah, so happy to talk.
Lovely. Thank you so much for that, Antonia. I mean, I've got lots of things, lots of notes, and I could see people on the screen taking notes as well. So thank you so much for that. Now we'll open up for questions. Does anybody have any questions? If you do, just unmute yourself and go for it if you like.
Yeah, feel free to challenge anything. Don't worry. That's the beauty of this meeting today, is to actually think about, is this feasible? Is this useful? Is this crazy? Or is this just adaptable to other contexts?
While people are just sort of getting their head around some of the questions, I might jump in with a question for you actually here, Antonia. Look, thank you once again. And earlier on, you talked a little bit about focusing on the story and focusing on the process, for example. And quite often, when I use it in my context at my university, for example, often colleagues talk about, okay, well, this particular student was naturally very creative and therefore they came up with a fantastic end piece kind of thing. But I often like to focus on, I think Carl and I, we've talked about it many times, about the processes that people go through. So how much emphasis, so when we embed this methodology, this approach into an assessment, how much of it, or how do you balance the creativity of the final product and the processes?
Yeah, that's very important. And it's incredible because, as I said, I spent 9 years in Loughborough University. It was known worldwide as the best sport university. So I very often reflect on certain sport dynamics to think about. I like to just move into another disciplines to challenge what I'm doing in my own discipline. I often use sport as a way of thinking and challenging my way of doing things. So, and I often think about, you know, a teacher of physical activity, right? So there are kids who are naturally oriented to certain sports. So what should they mark? Should they mark their achievements compared to their actual performance at the end? Or should they mark the commitment, intensity of engagement with activity? You know what I mean? Is that challenge of, are we marking the actual result abstracted by the developmental process at the end? So my answer, from my perspective, what I give more importance to is the generosity of each individual in committing to in supporting the development of others, at least in my groups. And this is why I thought that the first story I was going to share was particularly important, because that student, she was not just working on her own narrative, her own digital story, but she's been very active in providing feedback to other students. And therefore, the tricky bit is, how do we observe and monitor that development and that commitment to collective learning? And again, back to co-creation. So another challenge, for example, Pranit. So if we emphasize this co-creation bit, this collaborative element, and there was the same group of statisticians in this data science models. The majority of them, they were not from Britain. And some of them, they asked peers whose first language was English to do the voice recording for them. So now, what am I marking? Am I marking their ability to speak English? Not. You know what I mean? It's like, but I wanted them to do that. I wanted that to happen, because for me, what I was valuing in that particular moment was that a person who is a data scientist, very often working on their machine, with very isolated, was actually embracing a new process, a new way of working with other students. And therefore, what really mattered was the availability to explore new ways of working. So, but from an assessment perspective, we need to make sure that we clarify those dynamics in the criteria. So, for example, in the marking criteria, I was emphasizing this collaborative element and this ability to take risk. So, for example, creativity is very often a gift. So I think, or is thought to be a gift, but could also be something that is embraced as a collective developmental process. So that is putting yourself at the service of someone else. If you don't have that particular skill, but still, it could be somehow even replaced by collaboration and co-creation.
I love that. I really like the analogy with sports as well. Putting myself in that shoes. For example, going through high school, I was never able to kick goals, but the effort certainly wasn't lack of effort. So I think it's a fantastic analogy. I've got a few more questions, but I'll leave it open to other people to jump in.
All right. Valeri's here. Thank you very much for your presentation. And I wanted to clarify about the generative AI, and whether it is something that you explicitly discuss with students, and whether you consider that it can be a positive tool, to help drive some of the aspects of ideation, and be like used as a, that peer, right, as a sounding board, even though I understand it's not human, right? But yeah, I would like to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the question. So as you can imagine, over time, AI has been also evolving very quickly. So our initial starting point probably evolved at the same speed. Personally, I'm always open. I think that innovation is always great. And the more we allow students to experiment with innovative tools, the better it is to make sure that they have a conscious understanding of how they work. And actually thinking about the collaborative element. So back to collaboration, what role could AI play in this collaborative environment? In a way that is, so for example, for international students, helping them rephrase certain sentences. Are we sure that it's better to rephrase that sentence? So for example, I really, one of my personal battles is to keep my accent. It's not, of course, it's by convenience because I can't change it. But what I'm saying is that I think that is expressing the uniqueness of who I am. And I'm not worried about mistakes anymore. Maybe 10 years ago, I was very embarrassed by mistakes. Today, I'm no longer, because I think that, they offer an opportunity to reflect on failure, or reflect on, imperfection, or reflect on improvement. You know what I mean? It's allowing everyone to try and then take the distance. So go in the proximity of something and then analyze the use of that something, and then understand benefits and challenges of that, and then deciding how far or how close you want to be with that something. But I believe in that we should not resist against the use of AI, but we should make sure that we have a clear conversation on why it can be used and what the benefit could be. Because of course, generative AI can be used also in filmmaking now. But in digital storytelling and I see there is Sarah here, so she might have heard this several times. But in the way in which I think about digital storytelling, the video making is not a quick process. So generative AI is to speed up the process, whereas the way in which I think of digital storytelling is as a slow learning process. So it's exactly the opposite. So that the more we are able to even, and this is why the example of the additional step of the collaborative storyboarding exercise, to even, okay, let's stop. Why is this not working? Let's do something else, and let's reflect together. Let's slow down. Let's go back to the objective we had as a group, and let's pause. Whereas, generative AI is all about let's do things faster and faster. And so even just talking about why do we need to do things more quickly? What are the benefits of doing things quickly? What is staying with us for longer? The things we do more quickly, or the things we reflect on, we debate on, we argue on? And also the other aspect I reflect on very often when I think about AI is sentiment. So as an Italian, I've got I'm directed by sentiments in a very in a very deep way, and I fully value sentiments in learning as well, and memorizing feelings, and the role of feelings in remembering certain experiences or certain opportunities for learning. And therefore, I would reflect with students about where are the sentiments of this machine. So what are your sentiments? What are your reactions? Why is it important to include feelings and sentiments in the learning process? And I know there is a colleague, Michael, you work with numbers. I thought in my life I hated numbers, but actually it's not true. It's just because I didn't hate the process of learning mathematics at primary school. It's just, actually I loved numbers, and I'm now I've been teaching on a data science master's degree. You know what I mean? It's like, and sometimes you find refuge in something as a defense mechanism. And feelings and sentiments are essential to understand behaviors, and behaviors are essential in the learning process, as Ben was saying earlier as well. So sorry, long answer.
It was a beautiful answer. Thank you so much. It gives us so much to reflect upon. Thank you.
You're too kind.
Thank you so much. When you said, I was getting worried, you said that you hated numbers. I said, how did she end up with a computer science background? I mean, we are running out of time, but I think we can entertain one more question. If anybody's got one more question, please.
I'd like to jump in with this question. It's Sarah here on the generative AI. I was really appreciating, Antonia, your discussion of our, I don't know what word you use, but responsibility to sort of co-train AI in these complexities and counter narratives that aren't typically in the large language models. And I wondered if you could just talk a little bit more about that, because I like that idea of really naming that responsibility that we have of co-training AI.
Yeah, this is something that is emerging in research. And thank you, Sarah. Lovely to hear your voice. I know it's quite early there. It's a responsibility from a research perspective. I know I'm aware that now there is a new movement of colleagues of trying to include the arts and humanities in the process of developing AI to really rethink about this complexity. Because I think, why don't we get as an answer when we ask a question to, I don't know, ChatGPT or Perplexity or whatever, why do we get one answer? Why don't we get a range of answers? Why don't we get, or actually it might be in a different way, why don't we get a sort of uncertainty? You know what I mean? It's like human beings are made by uncertainty, and but we are looking for just one answer, but it's not true. So I think there is an important commitment from collaborative work, interdisciplinary work, to actually make sure that we don't lose interest in complexity, uncertainty, and contested narratives, not conflicting. Because actually I strongly believe in the role of story and storytelling for conflict resolution, and therefore we really need to occupy that space. And but that's an important big question that would be great to actually reflect on together from different perspectives when we have more time. But I'm fully committed on this work in and this is white truth. So we are sold those answers as truthful, or the facts that are not in any way challenged, cannot be challenged in any way. Whereas I'm always challenging. Whatever you ask me, or whatever you tell me, even as a joke, I would challenge that now with the students. I'm saying, to make sure that they don't give anything for granted, but there could be another way of thinking, and just shifting perspective. And this is why storytelling is so beautiful, because if you just move perspective, things are different, and you can make it even more visually appealing, because it's just take a step forward, move right, move left, you will see things in a different way. So, and this is what we are missing at the moment. But yeah, sorry for the long answer again. But
not a problem. I wouldn't expect anything less from a storyteller. So, look, we have run out of time. Thank you so much for the presentation, Antonio, and thank you everyone for joining us. I mean, you have certainly sort of invoked a lot of curiosity in me. I was particularly into the other question that I was going to ask you was around emotions and sentiments, but I think you've covered that when you talked to Valeria about that as well. So once again, thank you so much, and thank you everyone. As I mentioned earlier on, we have recorded this, and actually I've got to stop the recording, and I will